Have you ever been humiliated in front of the person you love by someone who thought you were beneath them? That was me, sitting at my boyfriend's family dinner table when his father decided to insult me so cruelly. I'll never forget it. What he didn't know is that I wasn't just some girl he could laugh at. By the end, I ended his plans for good. And trust me, he never saw it coming. Before I tell you how it all happened, don't forget to hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more shocking betrayal and revenge stories every single day. My name is Eliana, and this story is about the night I realized that sometimes betrayal doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes from the very people who are supposed to become your family. At the time, I was 25 years old, young, hopeful, and madly in love with my boyfriend, Daniel. We had been dating for nearly 2 years, and when I say he was the love of my life, I mean it. He wasn't just some guy I liked. I saw my entire future with him. I imagined us getting married, buying a home, maybe having children one day. Everything about him made me feel safe, cared for, and understood. Except for one thing: his father. Daniel's father, Richard, was a man who carried power in every step. He was in his early 50s, sharp suits, expensive watches, and a voice that demanded attention even in silence. He was the type of man people either respected or feared, sometimes both. He had built his empire from old money, and he held on to the belief that only those born into wealth and status deserved to sit at the same table as him. And then there was me. I wasn't poor by any means, but my life had been built through hard work. My parents weren't rich. My dad was a teacher, my mom a nurse. I worked jobs all through college to pay for tuition. I had just started building my career in marketing, scraping together achievements that felt huge to me, but laughable in the world Richard lived in. From the very first time I met him, I felt his judgment. He never said it outright, but his eyes told me everything. You don't belong here. Daniel, on the other hand, never cared about status. He loved me for me. That's what I held on to. That's what kept me going, even when I could feel Richard's silent disapproval. But everything boiled over on the night of the infamous dinner. Daniel's mother had invited me for a family gathering. She had always been warm toward me, and I thought maybe, just maybe, things would get better. Maybe Richard would finally see that I wasn't some gold digger or outsider trying to take advantage of his son. I remember standing in front of the mirror before leaving, smoothing down my dress. It wasn't flashy, just a soft navy blue dress that was elegant but simple. I wanted to look respectable, not like I was trying too hard. I even bought a small necklace that matched, just to show I cared about the occasion. When we arrived, Daniel's mom greeted me with a smile and a hug. His younger sister waved excitedly and asked me about work. For the first 20 minutes, I almost felt like family. Like maybe things were turning around. But Richard sat at the head of the table, watching me. His gaze was sharp, like he was studying every movement, every word I said, waiting for me to slip up. We had just finished the main course when he raised his glass. I thought it was going to be a normal toast, something about family or good food. Instead, his voice cut through the air, laced with a smirk. "Well," he said slowly, "it's always nice to welcome guests." His tone was polite, but dripping with sarcasm. My stomach tightened. He glanced at me briefly, then continued. "Although some guests don't quite match the table they sit at." The room fell silent. The air turned heavy. I could hear the clink of my fork against the plate as I froze, my fingers trembling. Daniel looked down. His mother's eyes widened, and his sister shifted uncomfortably. But Richard. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the silence like it was dessert. And then, as if the first insult wasn't enough, he added, "Some people climb their way up, but no matter how hard they try, they'll never really fit into certain families. Isn't that right?" The words hit me like a slap across the face. I could feel the heat rushing to my cheeks. My throat burned, my chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might actually cry right there at the table. Every insecurity I had about not being enough, not being good enough for Daniel, had just been spoken aloud, weaponized in front of everyone. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but my voice refused to work. I swallowed hard, gripping my fork so tightly my knuckles turned white. What hurt even more than Richard's words was Daniel's silence. My boyfriend, the man I loved, just stared at his plate. Not a word. Not a defense. Not even a glance at me. It was like I had been abandoned twice in the same moment. I excused myself from the table under the pretense of needing water. But really, I just needed to breathe. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving, tears stinging my eyes. Why? I asked myself. Why do I put myself through this? The easy choice would have been to walk away, from the dinner, from the relationship, maybe even from Daniel altogether. But something inside me hardened that night. Richard thought I was beneath him. He thought he could humiliate me and I would just shrink, disappear, prove him right. But he underestimated me. As I wiped my tears in the hallway mirror, I made myself a promise. This wouldn't end here. This wasn't just about one cruel insult at dinner. This was about power, about respect, and about teaching Richard that he couldn't just break people for fun. By the time I walked back into that dining room, I wasn't the same girl who had been humiliated minutes earlier. I smiled politely, finished my meal in silence. But inside, a storm was brewing. Richard had no idea that his little speech had just set into motion something he would never forget. And I was going to make sure of it. Richard's words hung in the air like poison, clinging to every corner of the room. For the rest of that dinner, I felt like I was shrinking into myself. Every glance from him a reminder that I didn't belong. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, a silent gesture of comfort. But it wasn't enough. His silence in the face of his father's cruelty carved a deeper wound than the insult itself. When the night finally ended, I sat in Daniel's car, staring blankly out the window. My voice trembled when I finally spoke. "Why didn't you say anything?" Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Bella, if I'd fought him there, in front of everyone, it would have made things worse. You don't know him like I do." "Worse for who?" I shot back, my eyes filling with tears. Because it was already worse for me. That night, I cried myself to sleep. But the pain didn't vanish with the morning. Instead, it lingered, burrowing deep inside me like a festering wound. I couldn't shake the humiliation. Every time I replayed Richard's smirk in my head, my chest tightened with anger. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing how much his voice lingered in my life. At work, I'd sit in meetings trying to sound confident, but his words, "Some guests don't quite match the table," echoed in my mind, making me doubt myself. At night, when Daniel and I tried to talk about the future, I couldn't focus. His silence that evening haunted me, making me wonder if deep down he agreed with his father. Things reached a breaking point when Daniel invited me to another family event. "It'll be different this time," he promised, holding my hands tightly. "Dad was out of line. He just needs time. Please, Bella, give him another chance." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself maybe he'd be civil this time. Maybe, just maybe, he'd realize how much Daniel loved me and at least respect that. I was wrong. The second dinner was worse than the first. Richard barely acknowledged me, only offering curt nods when I spoke. At one point, while I was sharing a funny story about work, he cut me off mid-sentence to ask Daniel about his promotion. The humiliation stung all over again, but I forced myself to smile, to hide the storm building inside me. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone, Richard cornered me in the hallway. His voice was calm, but his words pierced like daggers. "You seem like a nice girl, Eliana," he said, his eyes scanning me like I was an item on display. "But nice doesn't buy respect. Nice doesn't open doors. My son deserves a partner who can elevate him, not drag him down. You'll never be that." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, to tell him he was wrong. But for the first time, I saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't going to change. He would never see me as worthy. That night, something inside me shifted. His insults didn't just hurt anymore. They lit a fire. Instead of breaking, I felt a spark of defiance. If he wanted me to feel small, then I'd rise higher. If he wanted me to feel unworthy, then I'd prove just how wrong he was. But defiance wasn't enough. I was still stuck in a painful cycle of trying to please Daniel E.'s family while feeling crushed under Richard S. disapproval. Every event, every dinner, every interaction was another round of subtle jabs and condescending smiles. And each time Daniel failed to stand up to him, my trust in him cracked a little more. The escalation came not in fiery explosions, but in quiet, relentless battles. Like the night Daniel casually mentioned, "Dad thinks I should focus on women who understand our world better." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "And what did you say?" Daniel hesitated, then sighed. "I told him I love you. But Bella, he's not going to stop. He doesn't think you'll ever fit." The words gutted me. Not because I needed Richard's approval, but because Daniel's uncertainty slipped through in his tone. For the first time, I wasn't sure if our love would be strong enough to survive the weight of his father's disdain. Weeks turned into months, and the tension grew unbearable. Every time we visited his family, Richard found subtle ways to belittle me. He'd compliment another guest's career in finance while ignoring mine. He'd joke about how some people marry up to survive while staring directly at me. His words weren't just cruel, they were calculated, designed to chip away at my confidence. And it worked. For a while. I found myself questioning everything, my career, my self-worth, even my relationship with Daniel. Was I really enough? Did I truly belong in his world? Or was Richard right, that no matter how hard I tried, I'd never match their table? But then, one night, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I saw the dark circles under my eyes, the slump in my shoulders, the spark that had dimmed since Richard came into my life. And I realized something important. Richard wasn't destroying me. I was letting him. That night, I made a vow. I would stop chasing his approval. I would stop letting his voice dictate my worth. If he thought I didn't belong, fine. But I would prove, to him and to myself, that I was stronger than his narrow world could ever imagine. What I didn't know then was that fate would hand me the perfect chance. Richard thought he could break me down. But soon he'd learn that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of his life. The night after the dinner that changed everything, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the darkness of my small apartment, replaying the words over and over in my head. "You don't belong here. Women like you are just a distraction." His voice echoed like venom, dripping into my heart until it felt like it was rotting from the inside out. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my boyfriend's father's smug face, the disdain in his eyes, the subtle smirk he tried to hide behind his wine glass. And worse than all of it, the silence of my boyfriend. The man who was supposed to defend me, to be on my side, had sat there, frozen. He shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. That silence screamed louder than any insult. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe I should let it go. But the truth was, it wasn't just about me. It was about respect. If I didn't stand up for myself now, then when? And to whom? I knew in my bones this was the turning point, not just for me, but for the relationship itself. Over the next few days, I noticed how differently I looked at my boyfriend. Before, I saw a man I loved, someone I imagined a future with. Now, every time I looked at him, I saw hesitation. I saw cowardice. When I gently brought up the dinner, he brushed it off. "Dad just has strong opinions," he said. "Strong opinions?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "He humiliated me, in front of you, in front of everyone." He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my eyes. "You know how he is. If I had said anything, it would have just made things worse." That was the moment I realized. He was never going to defend me, not against his father, not against anyone. And something inside me hardened. At first, the thought of revenge was just a spark. Faint, almost invisible. I didn't want to be the kind of person who plotted against people. But the more I thought about it, the more that spark caught fire. His father had not just insulted me, he had tried to erase my worth. He wanted me gone, cast aside like I didn't matter. And if he wanted war, then fine. I would give him one. But this wouldn't be some petty payback. No. I wanted something lasting. Something that would make him regret underestimating me. Something that would hit where it hurt. The problem was, how? He was wealthy, established, respected in his community. He owned a successful real estate business and was the kind of man who thought his power made him untouchable. But everyone has cracks in their armor. I just needed to find his. I started small. Whenever my boyfriend mentioned his father, I listened more closely. I asked subtle questions, feigning casual curiosity. I learned that his father's business wasn't as spotless as it looked. He bragged often about deals closed, properties acquired, but behind the polished exterior there were whispers. Properties flipped hastily, land acquired under questionable circumstances. He wasn't above cutting corners, and his greed often outweighed his caution. So I dug deeper. I began searching property records online. I visited county websites, browsed real estate forums. Late at night, while my boyfriend slept beside me, I pored over public documents, spreadsheets, anything I could find. And then, I found it. A series of land purchases that didn't add up. Dates that contradicted his stories. Transactions made through shell companies that looped back suspiciously close to his name. It wasn't enough to prove anything illegal outright, but it was enough to raise questions. Questions that, in the right hands, could topple reputations. But every time I got excited about my discovery, doubt clawed at me. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to destroy a man's legacy because he insulted me? And then I remembered his smirk, his condescension, his words, "You don't belong here." I did belong, and I was going to prove it, not by begging for acceptance, but by showing him that I wasn't a woman to be trifled with. The plan had to be perfect. Revenge only works if it's clean, calculated, and impossible to trace back. Step 1. Collect evidence. I compiled every suspicious document I could find. I screenshotted transactions, saved PDFs, printed copies in case files mysteriously disappeared. Step 2. Find allies. I reached out to an old college friend who worked as a journalist. She owed me a favor, and she had always been hungry for big stories. I didn't give her everything at once, but I hinted at corruption, shady real estate deals, a big name involved. Her interest lit up like a flame. Step 3. Control the narrative. I knew I couldn't appear bitter or vengeful. If anyone suspected this was personal, the story might collapse. So I carefully removed myself from the equation. Everything would appear to come from an anonymous source. Over the next few weeks, I fed my journalist friend just enough information to keep her hungry. She started investigating quietly, reaching out to sources, double-checking the records I'd found. Meanwhile, I played my role perfectly. Around my boyfriend and his family, I acted normal, pleasant, almost submissive. I smiled when his father made snide remarks. I nodded politely. I let him believe he had won, that his insults had cowed me into silence. Inside, I was on fire. Somewhere along this journey, I realized the revenge wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about me, about reclaiming the part of myself that had been diminished over the years, not just by him, but by countless others who thought they could dismiss me, underestimate me, silence me. Plotting his downfall gave me a strength I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that I wasn't powerless, that I had intelligence, determination, and grit. And when harnessed, those things were more dangerous than any insult could ever be. I also knew this plan could destroy my relationship. If the story broke, and his father's name was dragged through the mud, there was no way my boyfriend wouldn't connect the dots. But by then, I wasn't sure I cared. Love without respect isn't love. And if he couldn't stand beside me against his father's cruelty, then maybe he wasn't the man I thought he was. So I prepared myself. For the storm, for the break, for whatever came next. Weeks turned into months. My journalist friend had uncovered more than even I expected. Former employees of his father's company were willing to speak. Other questionable land deals came to light. A picture was forming, not of a successful businessman, but of a greedy man cutting every corner possible. The night she called me and said, "We're running the story," I felt my heart stop. This was it. The point of no return. I hung up the phone and stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. Not weak, not broken, not erased. Strong, determined, alive. And I whispered to myself, "You don't belong here. Watch me burn it all down." When the story went live, it felt to me like someone had flipped a switch in a dark room, and suddenly every face in the room turned toward me. The piece ran on a weekday morning, an investigative feature on my journalist friend's site, amplified by social channels and then picked up by larger outlets. I remember the moment I refreshed the page and saw the headline, "Local Real Estate Mogul Under Scrutiny, Questionable Land Deals and Shadow Companies Exposed." Beneath it, scanned PDFs, screenshots, and neatly summarized interviews painted the picture my late-night research had hinted at. It read like an accusation, but it was backed with enough public documentation and eyewitness accounts that it read like something the court of public opinion could actually believe. For a second, I felt nothing. No triumph, no burst of joy. Just a hollow, dislocated calm, as if I was standing outside my body watching the scene unfold. Then the messages came. At first, they were cautious. Anonymous tipsters calling the online newsroom, late-night emails describing suspicious transfers, comments under the article making thinly veiled references to a certain family they could no longer respect. Then, the deluge. Strangers tagging the article, old acquaintances texting, "Did you see this?" and my phone lighting up with calls. One of Daniel S. colleagues sent the link to our shared group chat with a string of question marks. Friends and coworkers asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was fine. The public reaction was a slow, building roar. The article was shared across platforms. People who had once admired Richard S. achievements now clicked on the comments and read about shell companies and expedited zoning approvals. The trust he had built over decades, household foundations, philanthropic appearances, ribbon cuttings, began to wobble under the weight of scrutiny. And then it got personal. Daniel called, voice a brittle mix of anger and fear. "Who did this?" he demanded before I could answer. I listened to his heartbeat through the phone. I could hear his hand tapping the steering wheel. "Eliana, if this is a prank..." "It's not a prank," I said calmly, the steadiness in my voice surprising me. "You know I didn't do this to hurt you. I did what I had to do." I held my breath. I expected him to shout, to accuse, to ask me how I could be so cruel. Instead, he paused, and the silence was a chasm.
"How could you?" he finally said. "Wasn't he angry? How could you? I expected. It was small, hurting, betrayed. Dad's going to lose everything. People are going to talk. We can't." His words trailed off. "We can't go through this, Bella." He didn't say, "We'll get through it together." He said, "We can't. The words landed like stones. Within 48 hours, the first domino fell. Richard's main investor foundation that had previously funneled large sums into his ventures issued a quiet statement distancing itself from pending deals. Local business partners froze negotiations. Suppliers delayed contracts. The accounts departments that had once moved at Richard's command began requesting additional documentation. Little by little, the scaffolding of his empire creaked. Television morning shows ran bites from the investigative report. Overnight, opinion columns pitched in, op-eds about wealth, ethics, and the privilege of untouchability in the city's elite. People who once stood in line at Richard's charity gala now picked apart his balance sheets on public forums. And then the calls to his office started. Not the kind of calls from nervous subcontractors, but the kind that came from attorneys and regulators. I watched the timeline, my stomach tight. As the city's planning commission announced a preliminary review of several recent approvals tied to his companies, a regulatory audit was being discussed in a tone that used words like conflict of interest and irregularities. At home, Daniel stopped sleeping. He paced our small apartment at all hours, cigarette butts he hid in flower pots, fingers red from pinching his knuckles. His eyes had a new hardness to them mixed with the beginnings of anger. "You have to fix this," he told me one night hunched over the sink. "Have to tell them you don't know who leaked that?" His voice cracked. "Ileana, we're in trouble." I looked at him and felt something so definite and cold that this relationship had been on hold while his family's facade stood. The moment that facade crumbled, so did his loyalty. Not instantly. He still loved me, I think. But when reputation was at stake, he found himself on the slippery slope between self-preservation and defending the woman he claimed to love. His choice tilted toward safety, toward the side with fewer questions and fewer consequences. There was also the private fallout within the family. The article had lit a match under dinner table conversations. Word of it reached neighbors, the college alumni board Richard had chaired for years, and then his smaller inner circle. His daughter unfollowed him on social media. His sister called him with an icy voice and asked one pointed question: "Is it true?" The way she said it, like someone asking if they should still let their child play in the kiddie pool, made my skin crawl. For me, vindication arrived wrapped in discomfort. Friends sent congratulations, but they tried to keep their voices down when they said it. My journalist friend called once more, voice elated and practical. "We've got more leads," she said. "People are calling. Regulators are asking questions." "You did this very cleanly. We're covering our sources." I felt a flash of predangerous and heady but, even as I told her to proceed. My chest tightened with the knowledge that this would not be without cost. The first contact from Richard himself came 2 days after the article. He left a voice message on Daniel's phone brief, venom controlled. "There are dangerous people out there willing to ruin reputations for sport," he said. "Careful whose door you knock on." The threat was thinly veiled and pointed. I replayed the message until I could hear the mechanical calm under his words. It was the voice of a man who had never been challenged until now. Then the calls from Daniel's relatives started to drift through our lives like cold drafts. Daniel's mother left a single, short voicemail, for me warmth, strained and brittle. She sounded like someone trying to hold together 2 collapsing plates with tape. "Sweetheart," she said, voice shaking. "If there's anything we can do." She didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need her to. She was begging me quietly to make it stop. I could have gone to them, could have confessed and begged for mercy. But I had made a decision. There was a lesson to be taught, and it would be most effective if it was felt across the house, not silenced in a private apology. Besides, how many times had I swallowed my pride to keep the peace? This was not the night. The legal threat started in earnest a week later. Richard's legal team sent a cease on desist letter to the news outlet, a dense, lawyerly document that accused the reporter of defamation and demanded corrections. My journalist friend held firm. Providing her editors with the records I'd given her and the corroborating statements from former employees, she responded calmly. The newsroom had lawyers and legal insurance. They were ready for the fight.
Public opinion is a fickle tide. For every person outraged by my exposé, there was another who defended Richard, insisting the allegations were exaggerated or politically motivated. Comment sections devolved into tribal shouting matches that had nothing to do with my motives or his deeds. They were about sides, about social classes, about who deserved scrutiny. I tried to ignore it, but the noise seeped into the quiet places of my day. Daniel's anger became a churning thing. Some nights he spoke plainly about his fear of losing his inheritance. Others, he accused me of overstepping a line. "You could have quietly walked away," he said once, eyes rimmed red. "You could have let him be a monster and spared us the spectacle." His voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to shout that his father had been a monster for years, and I had just made everyone see it. Instead, I said nothing. The argument dissolved into tears and silence. And yet the revelations continued, one after another. A contractor came forward with proof of invoices marked up suspiciously. A former executive provided an affidavit about pressure to falsify documents. The local paper printed a timeline of questionable deals and added a sidebar about donations to politicians who favored his projects. The more that surfaced, the more it seemed Richard had created a house of cards that couldn't survive sustained breeze. As the press attention increased, the family's private fractures widened into public cracks. The board of one of Richard S.'s smaller companies convened an emergency meeting and requested he step aside while they reviewed the books. A charity he chaired paused fundraising events until the investigation concluded. The City Planning Commission postponed a lucrative rezoning vote linked to his interests. I remember the day his office windows lost their gleam. Walk past them, and you could see behind the glass men and women whispering, looking at spreadsheets. The air had changed. It was no longer business as usual. It was triage. The morning when the first of the financial journals ran a detailed analysis, Daniel came to me with eyes hollowed by sleeplessness and said in a voice that could not mask its tremor, "My father, he's starting to look cornered." He didn't look at me like he used to. He looked at me with the suspicion of someone who was reassessing his entire life's narrative. The fallout even affected people I had once considered neutral. My own family grew nervous. My mother called more often, voice small as she asked, "Are you sure you did the right thing?" My father, who had always been my quiet supporter, told me to be careful. "Powerful people don't fall easily, Bella," he warned. "There are consequences." His words were not meant to frighten me, but to steady me. I appreciated it, but I felt something else entirely, a steadier surety that I had acted correctly. There were moments when I questioned myself, simple, human doubts that made me feel suddenly petty or cruel. I would wake up in the middle of the night and imagine Richard in a meeting, palms pressed to his face, the ruin of a lifetime accelerating. Would it be a plea? Would he fight back with lawyers and PR? Would he find ways to make my life miserable in retaliation? And then I would imagine my child, future children, living in a world where women were not routinely dismissed with a smirk. The stakes felt larger than my hurt. One night, weeks after the article, Richard found me in a place I hadn't expected, at a small neighborhood cafe where I often worked on spreadsheets and emails. I had no idea he knew I was there. He sat at a table across from me, his presence filling the room like a sudden draft. He did not look the frail, broken figure of rumor. He looked angry and very much alive. "You orchestrated this," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You want to ruin me because I said I don't trust you. Congratulations. You've done well." There was a slow, sharp smile on his face, like someone who had been injured and found the energy for a final blow. I met his gaze and felt the full weight of the moment, the danger, the triumph, the moral ambiguity. "I didn't do this alone," I said. "But you should have thought about how you treat people before you created the enemy who would expose you." He leaned forward, voice low. "You should have walked away." There was a world of meaning packed into those words. He wasn't just telling me I could have left. He was telling me I could have avoided the consequences his fall would bring. I wanted to tell him that walking away would not have been proving anything. But the coffee shop was thin with witnesses. Instead, I stood, left a few bills on the table, and walked away. I heard him call out my name, but I didn't turn back. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines, statements, and the slow chipping away of a legacy. Legal maneuvers whirred, regulators sifted through files, boardrooms convened, names were scrubbed from lists. The man who had once made others feel small was now the one feeling it, and the sensation was not gentle.
By the time the city announced a formal inquiry into the approvals tied to Richard's companies, I was exhausted and strangely hollow. I had reached the summit of the revenge I had plotted, and the view was not what I had expected. It was messy people, lost jobs, charities put events on hold. Families like Daniel's were forced into the uncomfortable light of public scrutiny. My hands, once steady when compiling documents, shook when I moved through the days. Not with fear of legal consequences. I had kept my distance and the journalist had guarded sources, but with the knowledge that actions have ripples. And yet, even with the moral gray bleeding into my satisfaction, a new clarity emerged. The person who had laughed at me, who thought himself untouchable, had been forced by truth, by documentation, by many small people speaking up to answer questions he had hoped would never be asked. The power he wielded had been challenged not by one grand spectacle, but by a quiet, relentless accumulation of evidence and courage. There were losses. Daniel and I could not stitch the rent-battered fabric of our relationship back together. He moved out a month after the inquiry was announced, claiming he needed space. In truth, we both knew he had to reconcile his loyalty to his father with his life. We spoke once, in a parking garage, words thin and formal. He asked me if I regretted it. I told him I did not. It was true, yet my heart still pressed against the ghost of what could have been. And Richard, he did what men like him do. He hired an army of lawyers, launched countersuits, and started a reputation campaign that tried to paint the whole affair as the work of a jilted woman with a grudge. Newspapers printed his denials. Supporters rallied. The legal battles were not neat and they were not swift. Power fights back. The fallout made the world uglier in places I hadn't anticipated. Former employees who had cooperated with the investigation found themselves targeted for lawsuits. Your victory is rarely pure when it sharpens the knives of others. I learned with a sick clarity that justice and vengeance are not identical twins. They sometimes share DNA, but they often act like different animals. In the quiet after the first storm, I sat alone in my apartment and allowed myself to feel the complexity of it all. The rage had cooled into a reflective hum. I had toppled a man's public empire, leased its glossy edges, and opened the prospect of accountability. But the people I had loved, the collateral damage, the small human costs, they lingered. When the city announced preliminary charges tied to regulatory violations and a few civil suits were filed, I knew the system would take its course. I also knew that no headline would ever bring back the voice that had told me I did not belong. Nor would any ruling restore the gentle weight of a man willing to stand for me in public. That, I realized, was the real cost. Yet, as I looked back through the weeks, I also saw something that steadied me. Men like Richard had built their empires through carefully curated silence. They depended on people assuming things were fine. By breaking that silence, by bringing documents and people into light, I had changed the fabric of possibility for others who might have been quietly too afraid to speak. That reality comforted me in a way that vindication never could. The fallout was not a tidy victory. It was messy, morally fraught, and real. But it was a reckoning. Sometimes, I thought, as the city buzzed with new questions and new hearings, reckoning is the only way for truth to catch up with power. When I look back on that night, I can still feel the weight of the silence after my words hit the table like a thunderclap. My boyfriend's father, once smug and towering in his confidence, had been reduced to a man staring into the wreckage of his own arrogance. And me. I stood there, Not just as the girlfriend he thought he could belittle, but as a woman who knew her worth. A woman who had finally drawn a line no one could cross. In the days that followed, there was a strange calmness in me. Revenge, I had always believed, was supposed to taste bitter, a fleeting satisfaction that faded too soon. But this time wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. I realized that I had just struck back at him. I had reclaimed a part of my self-ID, almost let his words steal.
He never apologized to me directly, and maybe that was his pride refusing to bend. But the shift was undeniable. When I walked into that house again weeks later, the tone was different. He didn't crack his usual sly jokes at my expense. He didn't dismiss me with a wave of his hand. He stayed quieter, more measured, as if he finally understood that I wasn't someone he could toy with. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was shaken but supportive. He confessed later that he had been too afraid to stand up to his father, that years of being silenced had made him feel powerless at that table. My actions, he admitted, showed him what strength could look like, even when it meant burning a few bridges along the way. And that's when it hit me. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's about forcing people to see you, to respect you, to stop underestimating you. His plans for that perfect dinner, that perfect manipulation, had crumbled, and I didn't even need to raise my voice or shed my dignity to do it. Of course, it wasn't easy afterward. There were whispers in the family, rumors that I was too bold, that I had no respect. But those whispers only confirmed what I had always suspected. Respect, in their eyes, was obedience. And I wasn't about to give them that. In quiet moments, I'd think of the girl I used to be. The one who might have swallowed the insult, plastered on a smile, and told herself, "Don't make a scene." That girl would have gone home and cried herself to sleep, believing his words defined her. But I wasn't her anymore. I had faced the storm and walked out standing taller. And that, more than anything, was my real revenge. Life didn't suddenly turn into a fairy tale after that night. My boyfriend and I had to have hard conversations about what kind of future we wanted, especially with his father in the picture. But there was no going back. The balance had shifted. And whether his father liked it or not, he had been forced to reckon with me, not as someone's accessory, but as someone who could shake his world with nothing but the truth. I've often asked myself, would I do it again, knowing the fallout, knowing the tension it caused? And the answer is yes. 1,000 times yes. Because there comes a moment in everyone's life when silence feels like betrayal. Not just to yourself, but to every woman who has ever been told to sit down, be quiet, and endure. And I will never betray myself again. And that was my story. A story of insult, defiance, and the kind of revenge that does not come from shouting or fighting, but from refusing to be silenced. If you've ever been underestimated, disrespected, or made to feel small in a room where you deserve to stand tall, then you know exactly why I did what I did. This channel is all about moments like this. Moments of betrayal, moments of strength, and moments where the tables finally turn. Every day, I bring you stories that shock, inspire, and remind you that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply refusing to be broken. So, if you found yourself hooked to the end, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe for more powerful true-style revenge stories. Because trust me, this story was just the beginning. And the next one? It might just be even wilder. Until then, stay strong, stay bold, and never let anyone write your story for you.